What if I told you that a boy died for a few minutes and came back with a message from Jesus? Yes, you heard right. A real experience, a divine encounter, and a mystery that no one has been able to explain. What he saw and told a priest was so impressive that it left the entire community speechless. But before I reveal this incredible story, I need to ask you, do you believe that God speaks to us in ways we cannot understand? Do you believe that heaven is closer than we imagine? Many people spend their entire lives looking for a sign, an answer, a confirmation that God is hearing their prayers. What if this sign was right in front of our eyes? What if a simple child, without understanding the enormity of what he experienced, was the instrument used by God to give us an urgent message? The Bible teaches us that the Lord uses the little ones to confuse the wise, that he speaks through dreams, visions, and even near-death experiences. But are we prepared to listen? Today you will learn the story of Ethan Parker, a boy of just 8 years old, who went through something that defied logic, science, and even the faith of an experienced priest. For 7 minutes, Ethan was between life and death. For 7 minutes, his soul passed through a portal that many of us fear but also long to understand. And when he returned, his words carried a truth so profound that even the most skeptical were left without an explanation. Maybe you came here out of curiosity, but I tell you, this story did not come to you by chance. If you believe in the power of prayer, if you feel that God has something to show you today, then I invite you to stay with me until the end. Because what this boy saw could change the way you see life and eternity. Something inside you already feels that this story is not just a coincidence, and what comes next is even more shocking. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel now, because each video brings real testimonies, miracles, and proof that God is acting. Activate the bell and continue this journey, because great revelations are yet to come. Ethan Parker was a boy like any other. 8 years old, full of life, energy overflowing with every step. Since he was little, he has always been curious. One of those who ask about everything and want to understand how the world works. He ran barefoot around the yard, kicked the ball against the wall for hours, invented games and never seemed to get tired. For his parents, he was a gift. A sweet, loving boy, full of joy, who had a contagious laugh and a sparkle in his eyes that lit up any room. But no one imagined that that glow one day would reflect something far beyond this life. The Parker family was simple, but very united. On Sundays, they attended church together, always sitting in the same pew and listening attentively to the pastor's words. Ethan liked biblical stories, especially those that talked about miracles. He wondered what it would be like to live something like that, like those people who had direct encounters with God. What he didn't know was that he would soon have that answer in a way he could never have imagined. It was a hot afternoon in Texas. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, and Ethan, as always, was enjoying the day in the backyard. He ran from one side to the other, dodging invisible obstacles as if he were in a large stadium, narrating the game himself out loud. Everything seemed normal until, in an instant, the joke turned into tragedy. No one knows for sure how this happened. Maybe it was a misstep, a stumble on something you didn't see, a moment of distraction. What is known is that Ethan fell, and fell from a considerable height. The impact was strong enough to change the course of your life forever. The sound of falling echoed in the air. Inside the house, his mother felt her heart racing before she even understood what had happened. An inexplicable feeling made her run outside, and upon arrival, despair took over. Ethan was on the floor, motionless. Time seemed to have stopped. She screamed his name, shook her small body, but he didn't respond. Panic took over her. The father, who was a few meters away, came running and, seeing his son in that condition, knew that every second would be crucial. Without hesitation, he took Ethan in his arms and ran to the car. The drive to the hospital never seemed so long. With each red light, with each car that seemed to be in slow motion in front of him, the despair increased. He drove fast, but inside him the feeling was that time was against them. They arrived at the hospital and the medical team sprung into action immediately. Ethan was rushed in. Doctors went to work quickly, trying to bring him back. He didn't respond. Her small body was there, but there were no signs of life. The minutes passed and the tension increased. The heart monitor showed a straight line. Nothing. The silence that hung in the air was distressing. Ethan's parents stood outside the emergency room, holding each other's hands tightly, murmuring prayers that seemed to come from the soul. They asked for a miracle. They asked God not to take their son. The mother was shaking, the father tried to be strong, but his eyes were watery. Every minute that passed without an answer from the doctors seemed like an eternity. And then, the unthinkable happened. The doctors looked at each other. Time was running out. 7 minutes without vital signs. 7 minutes of struggle, of failed attempts. It was time to accept the harsh reality. But it was exactly at that moment, when everything seemed to have come to an end, that something changed. The monitor, which until now only showed a straight line, blinked. A sound, faint at first, but real. Ethan's heart started beating again. Astonishment gripped the medical team. This shouldn't be happening. For science, it was inexplicable. For the Parker family, it was God's answer. Ethan took a deep breath and slowly opened his eyes. But when he looked around, his eyes weren't confused, they didn't show fear. On the contrary, there was an inexplicable peace about him, a serenity that no one could understand. His mother ran to his side, crying, touching his face gently, as if to make sure he was really there. The father, unable to contain his emotion, held his hand tightly, without saying anything, just feeling the warmth of his son alive again. But it was when Ethan opened his mouth and whispered his first words that everything changed. "I saw Jesus." The impact of these words was immediate. The parents looked at each other, confused, not understanding exactly what he meant. The doctor stopped in the middle of a procedure, surprised by what he had just heard. The nurse next to her felt a shiver run down her spine, but Ethan didn't stop there. Still weak, with a soft voice, he continued, "I saw a church, and a man was there kneeling. Jesus told me that his prayer was heard." The words came out with difficulty, but with an impressive certainty for a boy of just 8 years old. He wasn't confused. He knew exactly what he had seen. Ethan's parents were unresponsive. "What do you mean a church? What do you mean a prayer was heard?" He had never said anything like that before, never demonstrated anything like that. But now he came back from death with such a specific message. The father tried to rationalize. "Maybe it was a dream," he said, trying to understand. But Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't a dream. I was there. I saw Jesus." What happened during those 7 minutes? What did Ethan see? What was he trying to say? The answers were just beginning to emerge. God guides us in ways we don't always understand. Have you ever felt a sign, a dream, or a feeling from him? Share in the comments. Write "I believe" and strengthen this message for those who need it. Ethan felt like he was floating, light as the wind, weightless, painless, fearless. He looked down and saw the scene unfolding before his eyes. His small body lay motionless on the stretcher, surrounded by doctors and nurses who were running from side to side, trying to bring him back. He saw his mother outside, her hands clutching her tear-stained face, her knees weak as if they would give way at any moment. His father, a strong man and always so sure of himself, was now bent over, holding his head in his hands, muttering something like a desperate prayer. But Ethan didn't feel despair. He was not afraid. There was an indescribable peace around him, something that no words could truly describe. It wasn't just the absence of pain, it was something bigger. A comfort that filled every part of his existence, a love so deep that it seemed to encompass everything around him. Then he realized he was being carried away, as if he was being pulled gently by an invisible force. He didn't resist. Somehow, I knew I needed to follow. Suddenly, the environment around him changed. The hospital disappeared and gave way to something completely different. He was in a vast field, with colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The grass beneath his feet wasn't just green, it was a vibrant gold, as if each leaf was covered in heavenly light. The sky was not blue, but a mixture of tones that danced between gold and purple, reflecting something far beyond human understanding. The air was light, pure, filled with something that made your soul vibrate, and that's when he saw him. The figure approached slowly, dressed in white, radiating a light so intense that, while it shone with incomparable strength, it was not blinding. Quite the contrary, it brought comfort, it brought peace. Ethan felt his heart quicken, not with fear, but with recognition. Deep in his soul, he knew exactly who that figure was. It was Jesus. Jesus' eyes were deep, filled with love, as if every look could tell a story, as if he knew Ethan even before he was born. His smile was welcoming. There was no judgment, there was no rush. There was only love, a love that transcended anything the boy had ever felt. Jesus stood before him and, without saying a single word, placed his hand on his shoulder. At that moment, Ethan felt something inexplicable. A wave of heat ran through his body, but it was no ordinary heat. It was an energy that touched every part of his essence, something that spoke directly to his soul. It was as if in that touch, all the truth of the universe had been transmitted to him. "You're not done here yet, Ethan. You need to go back." Jesus' voice was calm but full of authority. Each word seemed to vibrate in the air, echoing in a way he could never forget. Ethan frowned. He didn't want to go back. How could I want to? That place was perfect. There was no pain. There was no fear. Just peace. "But why?" Ethan asked, feeling a tightness in his chest. "Why can't I stay?" Jesus smiled, and that smile was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was as if in that instant, an entire universe was being revealed to him. Jesus did not respond immediately. He just looked at the boy and then pointed to something behind him. Ethan turned and saw a church that seemed familiar, but he couldn't identify exactly where. The doors were ajar, and inside, there was a man kneeling with his hands clasped in prayer. His face was covered in anguish, as if he was carrying a weight he couldn't bear alone. He spoke to God, but his words were desperate. Jesus pointed to him and said, "Tell him his prayer has been answered." Ethan felt a shiver run through his body. Who was that man? What was your prayer? Before I could ask, before I could fully understand, he felt his body being pulled back. It was as if he was being sucked back in, as if he were falling from an infinite height. The golden field, the intense light, the figure of Jesus. Everything began to distort, to crumble before his eyes. He tried to hold it, tried to stay there, but it was impossible. He needed to go back. Jesus had said this. Suddenly, Ethan felt something different. The weight of his body, the pain in his head, the sounds around him came back all at once. His chest rose suddenly, drawing in a rush of air as if he were emerging from underwater. His eyes opened. The hospital, the doctors, the white light over his head, everything was there again. He heard a scream. His mother ran to him, tears falling freely down her face. His father grabbed his hand, as if afraid he would leave again. The doctors, who seconds before were about to give up, looked at him as if they were witnessing a miracle, because that was exactly it. Ethan was back, but he was no longer the same, because he remembered. He remembered everything, every detail, every word. He remembered the golden field, the indescribable peace, the presence of Jesus. He remembered the church. He remembered the man kneeling, the pain on his face. He remembered what Jesus had said. Tell him his prayer has been answered. And then, his mouth opened, and with his voice still weak but filled with something much bigger than himself, he looked at his parents and said something that made everyone around him hold their breath. "I saw Jesus." God always finds a way to speak to us, whether through signs, dreams, or moments that seem coincidental but carry a greater purpose. Have you ever felt like he wanted to show you something? Share in the comments. Write, "Jesus lives," and help this message reach more people who need this confirmation. Ethan still felt heavy, as if he were between two worlds. His heart was beating fast, not from fear, but from the intensity of what he had just experienced. He looked around the hospital, the worried faces of the doctors, the emotional look of his mother, the astonished expression of his father. Everyone there was trying to understand what had happened, but no one, absolutely no one, could understand what he had just seen, because what Ethan saw was beyond human comprehension. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to reorganize his thoughts. The image was still clear in his mind. The church, the priest kneeling, his silent prayer filled with a pain that Ethan couldn't explain. He could see every detail, as if he were still there, as if he were still floating in that place where time and space didn't seem to exist in the same way as they did on earth. Jesus didn't explain to him who this man was, or why the message was so important, but Ethan knew, somehow, that that prayer needed to be answered. And it was then that another vision took over his mind. He saw people, many people, as if they were in an invisible queue, waiting for something he couldn't define. Some had serene faces, expressions of peace, as if they were waiting for something good, something great. But others seemed distressed, caught in a mix of confusion and sadness, as if they knew they were heading towards a destiny they couldn't escape. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. It was as if he was seeing the destiny of souls. He didn't know how to explain it, but he felt inside that some of those people were going to a place of light, There was something indescribably beautiful about the path they followed, as if they were being drawn to a home they should never have left. But there were others that moved away from the light, as if something was pulling them away towards a path that he couldn't fully see, but that made his soul shudder. He wanted to help them. He wanted to say something. He wanted to stop them from moving away, but he couldn't. Jesus was at his side the entire time, watching. Ethan turned to him and with a sinking heart asked, "What is happening? Where are they going?" Jesus just looked at him with that look full of love but also seriousness and said, "Each choice leads to a path." The phrase kept echoing in Ethan's mind. He felt a shiver run through his body, as if at that moment he was understanding something that previously seemed distant, almost impossible to understand. People were there because they had made choices. Every decision they made throughout their lives led them to a destination. Some chose light, they chose love, they chose God. Others moved away, and now they were heading down a path from which they could no longer return. Ethan wanted to ask more. He wanted to understand better. But before he could open his mouth, another scene took over his vision. Now he saw the city where he lived, its streets, its houses, the people who rushed past without noticing the world around them. But there was something strange. In the crowd he saw small points of light hovering over some people. Some glowed brightly, others were just a faint reflection, as if they were about to go out. He didn't understand what that meant, but he felt that these lights had a purpose. He looked at Jesus, confused, and asked, "What are these lights?" Jesus replied calmly, "Signs. Signs." That word kept ringing in Ethan's mind. Were they signs of protection? Warning signs? He didn't know. But something inside him told him that this was important, that he should remember every detail, that he should pay attention to the signs, because they were everywhere. Before he could ask anything else, everything around him began to fall apart again. The light that enveloped everything became more intense, stronger, and he felt as if he was being pulled back with a force he could not resist. He tried to hold the image, tried to record every detail in his mind, but everything started to become hazy. He heard Jesus' voice once again, soft but firm, tell him his prayer has been answered. And then everything disappeared. Ethan opened his eyes, panting. The hospital was silent. The doctors watched him in shock. His mother was crying and his father held his hand tightly. But none of that mattered, because he remembered. He remembered everything. And above all, he remembered the message he needed to deliver. God gives us signs all the time, but we are not always attentive to notice them. Have you ever felt like something protected or guided you without explanation? Share in the comments. Write, "I believe in God's signs," and strengthen this message, because what comes next can transform your view of divine action. The silence that took over the room lasted only a second, but for everyone there it seemed like an eternity. The heart monitor, which had previously displayed a straight line indicating that Ethan was no longer among the living, suddenly flashed. A sharp sound cut through the room, and then another and another. Ethan's heart started beating again. The doctors looked at each other in disbelief. That was impossible. He had been without vital signs for long minutes, a period of time that, according to science, should have already caused irreversible damage. But against all expectations, he was coming back. His mother, who was already overcome by despair, felt a wave of hope invade her chest when she saw her son's body give a slight spasm, his fingers moving minimally. She lunged forward, being restrained by a nurse as doctors rushed to assess her signs. Ethan's father, a man of faith but also of reason, couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. He had just prayed. He had asked God not to take his son, but deep down, he had already accepted that it was too late, until the impossible happened. And that was when Ethan opened his eyes. First he blinked a few times, confused, trying to get used to the light around him. The doctor's face appeared in his vision, then his mother's, who was now crying even more, but with relief. His father held his hand tightly, as if afraid that at any moment he might disappear again. But Ethan wasn't worried about any of that. He felt his chest rise and fall in a strong rhythm. He felt the warmth of his family's touch. He heard the sounds of the hospital in the background, but what really filled his mind, what dominated all his thoughts, was what had just happened. And that's when he spoke. With a weak voice, still hoarse but filled with absolute certainty, he said, "I saw Jesus." The entire room was silent. The doctor stopped in the middle of a procedure. The nurses looked at each other. His mother covered her mouth with her hands, and his father's eyes widened. Nobody expected to hear that, but Ethan didn't stop there. He felt he needed to tell, needed to share what he had seen. There was something inside him that compelled him to speak, as if the message he was given needed to be conveyed as soon as possible. He tried to sit up, but he was still weak. Even so, his eyes shone with an intensity that no one there had ever seen. He took a deep breath and continued, "I saw a church. There was a man kneeling, and Jesus told me that his prayer was heard." His father frowned, clearly confused. His mother knelt beside the bed, holding his face in her hands. "What church, son?" she asked, her voice shaking. But Ethan couldn't explain it. He clearly saw the place, the altar, the lit candles, the priest with his hands clasped, his eyes closed, his expression full of concern, as if he was desperately waiting for an answer. But he didn't know where this church was, nor who that man was. He looked at his parents, trying to find a way to make them understand. "He was asking God for something," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "And Jesus told me to tell him that his prayer was heard." His father ran a hand over his face, as if trying to take it all in. He was always a man of faith, but he was also rational. He couldn't deny that his son had just gone through something impossible, something that defied any medical explanation. But how could Ethan know that? How could you have seen something like that? The doctor looked at the parents and, in a professional but astonished tone, said, "Many people who have near-death experiences report visions, hallucinations. It could just be the brain trying to process the lack of oxygen." But Ethan shook his head immediately. "No," he insisted. "I know what I saw. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. I was there, I saw Jesus, and he gave me this message." Ethan's mother ran her hand through her son's hair, trying to calm him, but deep down she felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew her son. "I knew he wasn't making this up." The father just took a deep breath, trying to process it all. But a question echoed in his mind, a question he knew he would need to answer soon. If this was real, if God had really shown his son something, then what would they do now? God reveals himself in unexpected ways, touching lives and bringing answers when we need them most. Have you ever heard stories like this or experienced something similar? Share in the comments. Write, "I believe," and help this message reach more people who need to feel God's action. The days following Ethan's recovery were full of questions. The family was in shock. The doctors were at a loss for answers, and the people who heard her story simply didn't know how to react. The boy had been dead for several minutes. There was no scientific explanation for his return, much less for the clarity with which he remembered what he saw. But Ethan wasn't confused. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew he had been in the presence of Jesus. He knew he was given a mission. But there was something he still couldn't fully understand. Who was the man Jesus showed him? And what should he do now? Since returning from the hospital, Ethan has talked about the church he saw in his experience. He described every detail with precision. The tall stained glass windows, the candlelit altar, the dark wooden pews, the huge cross in the center. But the most impressive thing was how he spoke of the kneeling priest, the expression of anguish on his face, the way he cried out for an answer. And of course, the message Jesus delivered: tell him his prayer has been answered. His parents, despite their faith, didn't know how to react. At first, they thought it might just be an effect of the trauma, a dream that Ethan believed was real. But the way he spoke, with so much conviction, with so much detail, made doubting it impossible. How could a child of just 8 come up with something so profound? How could he describe a church he had never visited before? And what bothered Ethan's parents most was a question that kept echoing all the time. What if this really is a message from God? It was then that his father had an idea. He decided that they would take Ethan to some churches in the city to see if he recognized any of them. If this experience were real, he would know how to identify the location. If it was just imagination, he would hesitate, perhaps change his mind. But they needed to be sure. They needed to know the truth. The following Saturday, they got in the car and started touring local churches. Ethan, sitting in the back seat, looked closely at each of them, but shook his head every time they stopped. "Not that one," he said, until they arrived at a different place. As soon as the car turned the corner, Ethan's eyes widened. His body tensed, and he held his mother's arm tightly. "That's it," he whispered. His father looked at the building in front of him. It was a simple but imposing church, the stained glass windows exactly as Ethan had described, The altar, lit by candles, visible through the windows. The man's heart raced. "Are you sure, son?" he asked, still in disbelief. Ethan just nodded, his breathing quickening. "I know this place," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was here." The father parked the car, and the family got out. Little Ethan walked with hesitant but steady steps. He wasn't scared. He knew he needed to do this. As they approached the church door, a chill ran down their parents' spines. They didn't know what was about to happen, but something inside them told them that this moment would change everything. They entered. The environment was silent, welcoming, full of peace. Some people prayed in silence on the benches. Ethan looked around, his eyes taking in every detail. It was exactly as he saw it. Then something caught his attention. At the back of the church, kneeling before the altar, was a man in a cassock, or father. Ethan paused for a moment. His heart sped up. It was him, the same man he saw in his near-death experience, the same priest who was in deep prayer when Jesus showed him the vision. This was the man who needed to receive the message. He looked at his parents, and his father just nodded. "If that's what needs to be done, do it," he said. Ethan took a deep breath and took a few steps forward, walking towards the priest. As he approached, he felt something inexplicable, as if each step was guided by something greater than himself. The priest, focused on his prayer, did not notice the boy's approach until he felt a slight presence at his side. When he lifted his head, his eyes met Ethan's, and then the boy said the words that would change that man's life forever. "Jesus sent to tell you that your prayer was heard." The priest's face immediately turned pale. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His eyes became teary, and then he started to cry. Ethan stood there, still, watching the man in front of him become overcome with emotion. His body trembled, his hands pressed his face in a gesture of disbelief. Those words meant something to him. Whatever it was, Ethan knew that God had just given him the answer he had been asking for. After a few seconds, the priest took a deep breath and looked at the boy with eyes full of tears. "You said that? Jesus told you to tell me that?" he asked, voice cracking. Ethan just nodded. It was then that the priest revealed something that made everyone around him get goosebumps. "Last night I was here, right in this place, praying," he began. "I was asking God for an answer. I needed a sign, a confirmation. I needed to know he was listening to me." He paused, trying to contain his emotion, and then looked straight into Ethan's eyes. "And now a boy who has never seen me before, who has never been to this church, has just told me exactly what I needed to hear." Silence took over the environment. Ethan's father and mother were in shock. They didn't know what the priest's prayer was. They didn't know what he had asked God for. But at that moment, they knew one thing. What Ethan experienced was real. The priest looked at the altar and murmured a silent thanks. Then he turned to Ethan and smiled, still emotional. "Thank you," he said. "You were God's messenger today." God speaks to us in ways we don't always expect, often through people, moments, and signs that only make sense later. Have you ever experienced something like this? Share in the comments. Write, "I believe in God's signs," and strengthen that message, because your experience could be the answer someone needs. The experience Ethan lived changed everything. He came back to life, but something inside him was no longer the same. It wasn't just the fact that he saw Jesus, that he was sent back with a message, or that he met the priest whose prayer needed to be answered. It was the fact that he now knew. He knew heaven was real. He knew that God was present all the time. He knew that every choice we make takes us down a path, and that many people live without realizing it. Before the accident, Ethan was just a normal boy. He went to church on Sundays because his parents took him. He prayed before going to sleep because it was something he was taught, but without fully understanding the depth of this act. He heard about God, but he did not feel God. Now everything was different. He didn't just believe, he felt it. He saw signs everywhere. He knew that God was always there, watching, guiding, waiting for people to open their hearts to hear his voice. And this began to affect everything he did. His parents noticed the change immediately. Ethan used to be a restless, impatient boy, always wanting to play, always wanting to run. But now he spent long minutes in silence, looking at the sky, reflecting. He began talking to God all the time, not just in formal prayers, but in small moments throughout the day, as if he were talking to a friend who was always nearby. He had no doubts, no fear. His faith was now unshakable. His parents, no matter how religious they were surprised by the maturity with which he spoke about everything that had happened. How could a boy of just 8 have so much certainty, so much depth in his words? How could he speak of God's love with so much feeling, as if he had lived a whole life beside him? But the answer was simple. Ethan had experienced the divine. He was in the presence of Jesus. He was given a mission, and now he couldn't be the same anymore. The news about what happened began to spread throughout the city. First, family friends found out, then the neighbors, the church colleagues. Before long, the story had reached people Ethan had never met before. Many wanted to hear the story with their own ears, know every detail, try to understand what he saw. Some were skeptical, believing that it could all just be an illusion created by a child's brain. But many others felt something different when they heard his story. They felt the truth. People started coming to Ethan for advice, something that seemed absurd for someone so young. But there was something in the way he spoke, in the calmness he conveyed, that made people believe. He said that people must believe, because God is always listening to us. He repeated this phrase whenever they asked about his experience. For him, it was now very clear. God never abandons us, he always responds, but many of us are too distracted to notice. Ethan began to change the lives of those around him without even realizing it. He spoke about God with a simplicity that touched hearts. He said he felt when someone was sad and always tried to bring words of comfort. He said he knew God's love was real because he had felt it in the purest form possible, and people believed him. How can you not believe a boy who died and came back with this message? Children at school began to become more interested in spiritual matters. Some who had never prayed before began to do so. Others who were afraid of death began to see it differently. Adults have changed too. Some who had strayed from the faith began to reconsider. Others who didn't believe in miracles began to wonder, what if this is all real? What if there really is a bigger plan? Ethan also talked about something that deeply impressed him about his experience, the importance of choices. He saw the people in line, saw that some were moving toward the light while others were moving away. He knew it was no coincidence. Each one was going to the destiny they chose in life, and that worried him. The choices we make matter. He said this to everyone who asked about his vision. He said that every act, every thought, every decision brings us closer or further away from God. That was one of the biggest lessons he brought from the other side. Many people live thinking that there is plenty of time, that they can change later, that they can seek God later. But what if there isn't an after? What if the only chance to choose the right path is now? Over time, Ethan began to notice something else. He felt like there was something invisible around him, something he couldn't see with his eyes, but it was there all the time. He felt when something was right or wrong, as if there was an impulse inside him that showed the way. It was something he couldn't explain, but it made him feel protected, guided. And then he remembered the signs. In his near-death experience, he saw small lights shining on some people. Jesus said they were signs, but what did they mean? He didn't know for sure, but he started paying attention to his surroundings. He began to notice when something felt like a warning, when a feeling told him to make a different decision. He began to realize that God gives us signs all the time, but most people ignore them. And that's how Ethan began to teach something very simple, but powerful. If you feel like something is calling you closer to God, don't ignore it. He said that those who heard his story were not there by chance, that everything has a purpose, that just as he got a warning and a second chance, maybe others were getting it too. This story came to you for a purpose, and nothing happens by chance. If you felt the presence of God touching your heart, be part of this community of faith. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell to continue receiving transforming testimonies, uplifting messages, and proof that God is always guiding us. Together, we can take this truth even further. Getting this far means this story spoke to your heart, and that has a purpose. Leave your like now so that this message reaches more people and transforms lives, just as it touched yours. And I want to know who was really with me until the end. Comment here, I feel the voice of God, showing that, like Ethan, you believe he continues to speak to us in ways beyond our understanding. Something great still awaits you, and this journey is far from over. Click on the next video that appears on your screen and get ready for something that could change the way you see everything. There are messages that we only understand at the right time, and perhaps that moment is now. See you there.